No one in Phoenix expected that John Dodson would become the face of a national scandal. He was an ATF agent, quiet, methodical, stationed along a border where guns and drugs flowed with a brutal predictability. His job, like many others, was to disrupt that flow. What unfolded instead would expose a risky theory, a cascade of bad decisions, and a chain of consequences that reached into the highest halls of the Department of Justice. By 2009, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives had launched Project Gunrunner, an initiative to choke off the supply of U.S. firearms reaching Mexican drug cartels. One tactic, later known as Operation Fast and Furious, took a bold and dangerous turn. Rather than arresting suspected straw purchasers, certain Phoenix-based teams were told to let the guns walk in hopes of tracking them to kingpins across the border. Dodson began to notice patterns that didn't fit the strategy. Known straw buyers were allowed to buy multiple firearms from the same stores. Surveillance was spotty. Tracking technology and coordination with Mexican authorities were inconsistent. When Dodson raised those alarms internally, he says his warnings were dismissed and he was told to keep working the cases as instructed. The theory that allowing a handful of weapons to travel would lead to a breakthrough soured into tragedy. In December 2010, Border Patrol agent Brian Terry was ambushed and killed near the Arizona-Mexico line. Weapons linked to Operation Fast and Furious were discovered at the scene. The death electrified public outrage and transformed an internal investigative tactic into a national controversy. What followed was a tense public tug-of-war. Whistleblowers like Dodson went to Congress. Lawmakers demanded documents and answers. The Department of Justice and ATF defenders argued the operation was a legitimate effort to dismantle trafficking networks. Critics accused managers of reckless tactics and later of misleading Congress about what they had known and authorized. A formal probe by the Justice Department's Office of the Inspector General produced a damning picture of poor oversight. Agents in the field had been encouraged, explicitly or implicitly, to allow weapons to be trafficked. Paperwork and communication broke down. Mexican authorities were insufficiently involved, and the ability to monitor and interdict those weapons was far weaker than leaders had represented publicly. The report stopped short of concluding that senior DOJ officials had explicitly ordered the tactic, but it laid bare a culture of mismanagement and miscommunication that turned experimental policy into deadly reality. Political fallout intensified. In 2012, the House of Representatives voted to hold Attorney General Eric Holder in contempt for failing to produce certain internal documents about the operation. The episode became a flashpoint in debates over oversight, prosecutorial discretion, and the risks of clandestine law enforcement tactics. In the years that followed, there were internal disciplinary actions, apologies to the family of Agent Terry, and renewed calls for reform. Clearer interagency coordination, better documentation, and stricter limits on high-risk investigative techniques. For Dodson and other whistleblowers, the fight took a personal toll. For the families of victims and communities along the border, no policy change could erase a life lost in the dark. Operation Fast and Furious remains a cautionary tale about the gulf between intent and consequence. A tactic conceived to strike at the power of cartels instead exposed the fragility of oversight and the human cost of error. Documentary records, testimony, internal memos, and the Inspector General's findings trace how a gamble meant to yield cartels' leaders instead yielded congressional hearings, resignations, and a nation forced to reckon with the dangers that come when secrecy and strategy override caution. The story ends not with neat accountability, but with lessons. Agencies revised rules, courts and Congress debated new limits, and in Phoenix, where no one expected John Dodson to become a whistleblower, the fallout from a flawed plan still echoes, an unwelcome reminder that the line between law enforcement and recklessness can sometimes be razor thin, and that when it is crossed, lives pay the price.